Hello and welcome back to another episode of Track Talk. Today we are rejoined by OTDE. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm here again.
It's becoming kind of a meme with all of my guests. I never know how to start these. Okay, so today we are talking about Shortcuts, which is an interesting artistic piece done by OTDE, which is done within the last, or maybe done in the last 5 months, I think.
Yeah, I would say so. Um, I had a part that I left for I had the track and then I just kind of sat on it for several months and then I came back to it and finished it all in a couple weeks.
Fair enough. Now, I do remember seeing the naked track for this really ages and ages ago. So, how did the what was the conception of this track? How did it come about? And what inspired you to use the style that you did?
Okay, so the the idea for the track sort of sprang fully formed. This time it wasn't one of those sort of like I have a disparate bunch of ideas and I'm collecting them and I'm putting them together into a single track. This was like, here is my idea for a track. Um, I had read previously a graphic novel. I forget what its name was, but uh, it had these black and white scenes where there were these like trees and like sort of a woodland like gulch, a lot of like rivers, little like empty cliff areas, and I never really wanted to do anything like as detailed as that, but uh, I thought, oh, I could incorporate that into the first part of this track. And when I heard shortcuts, I was like, okay, there are three distinct sections here. Here's how I want this to play out. And so when I made the track, I had made it entirely with the scenery in mind from the start.
Interesting. So, when you say you heard Shortcut, so it was the song for this group of three kind of artistic pieces. The song itself is called Shortcuts.
Yes, it's a piece by the Flashbulb off of like real early 2000s album, which there's a bit of a strong history of using stuff from Curlian selections in a lot of old line writer pieces, mostly because a lot of the tracks off of Curlian selections are very like jittery and fast, and so during the time period that a lot of that stuff was made, a lot of line writer tracks were jittery and fast, and so you would see tracks like Passage D, which had this like piano over it, but with like this rich and complicated drum pattern over top of it, being used for like large scale collaborations that had people like Flag Capper uh, and like LRG and Red Devil, those kind of people.
Okay, awesome.
So yeah, I wanted to take more of there were some more thoughtful parts of that album, and I wanted to sort of show off the more thoughtful side of that of Curlian selections while sort of sticking to the faithfulness of using a piece that would not be out of the ordinary in like a late 2000s line writer track.
Sure, yeah. So, is this where the "from whence we came" quote in the description comes from then? If this is more of a reach back?
No, but it's nice. Uh,
Okay, it's
for
just
once,
me.
yeah. Well, I mean, in the given context that I've mentioned,
Mm,
it's a nice connection and it's one that you could make. Uh, if I like leaving it up to interpretation with that information added, it certainly seems like a fun interpretation to have. But when I wrote From Whence We Came, I was primarily referring to the fact that it ended up back at Clothesline,
yep.
um, which uh, the idea to put clothesline in at the end was a late idea, but from the beginning, I did want to signal like you are returning to a place. I just didn't know what that place was going to be until I finished up the track. Um, and I was in a call with, I think, uh, Rabid and Andrew Hess, the creator of Bug Thief. And I said to them like, "Oh, I could put shortcuts, or I could put clothesline in at the end of shortcuts," and they were both like, "Oh no!" And it was like, yeah, it
Very
was
nice.
I had a moment where it like all the pieces connected, and I realized like that was what I wanted uh, as sort of the capstone for the piece.
Sure, yeah. And for anyone who hasn't seen Clothesline, that's a little short that you made, I guess, back towards the end of 2017. Yeah,
Yep.
people go and check that out. So, I mean, one of the things I was going to ask, just because, again, I guess to offer because my previous interpretation of From Whence We Came, I guess I was expecting something more cryptic. So I guess I planned some of the questions a little differently. But sure. So one of the things I was curious about was whether this is like a throwback to, like the era of Tech Dog where we had much more like heavily scenery inspired tracks, or I mean, you're obviously from that era yourself. Are you just trying to revive the use of scenery in tracks?
See, honestly, I think Tech Dog is a little bit before my time. I was like 8 when Tech Dog was making stuff. Uh, but I did watch those videos really enthusiastically when I was a young kid. Uh, well, not 8, I was like 10 maybe. But like, I think what it is, I think this might have been subconscious on my part, but I'm not necessarily trying to emulate Tech Dog. Um, and nor do I really think anybody really should be trying to emulate Tech Dog. Um, I think a lot of the problems with scenery that I think we've presented this in the gamification video before. When scenery dropped off, it was specifically because scenery in Line Rider was parameterized. It was made into this like you do this to show that you're this good at scenery, you do this to show that you're this good at scenery, and so on and so forth. You had like it provided an easy path for uh, artistic complexity, and it established a linear relationship between artistic complexity and artistic goodness. Um, More specifically, the harder a thing was to do, the better it was. See where I'm going with this?
Yep.
uh, and shortcuts is not a hard track to make. It's tedious because it's a lot of the same thing. But the pattern itself that I use to create most of shortcuts is not a difficult one. Um, and one of my primary goals in making shortcuts was to have an artistic vision that was uh, simple but conveyed effectively. I think the Forest Under the Earth conveys some things effectively, but I think there were some parts in the process where I was more focused on like doing sort of tricks and stuff than making it feel like a landscape. And so my goal this time was to make it feel natural, to make it feel like something that could be feasibly ridden upon. Uh, I think something that's missing in a lot of I don't think Bosch is nearly humanized to the degree that we could in certain pieces,
Yep.
and by creating experiences that feel like you, the viewer, could insert yourself into Bosch's place and experience yourself, uh, with just a little bit of the fantastic added in. Uh, you can create very extreme and visceral experiences with Line Rider in a very unique way.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things obviously that pops out to me, having seen myriad of scenery tracks is normally scenery tracks appear to be a kind of canvas that Bosch is moving through instead of being a world that he's actually a part of. And one of the things
Yep.
that really struck me, with shortcuts is, as you say, Bosch is like traversing this landscape. First there's the forest scene, then we had the caves, and then the rolling hills. Those rolling hills, by the way, are easily my favorite part of that track. I love the way it just kind of shifts. Was that like one of the simplest parts to make as well, or?
I would say the simplest part to make was the cave system.
Mm.
The cave system is something I've already done with the Forest Under the Earth. Is something where I have a refined sense of how I want speed to work, how I want people to experience speed. I don't know if this technical detail about shortcuts has been made public, but what you're actually watching in shortcuts is not a single recording. Shortcuts is 2 recordings of the same track, but I did 2. The first was in 60 frames per second with smooth playback in a beta build of linewriter.com, and the other is a 40 frames per second native build.
Oh, I see.
So I did this for a couple reasons. Number one, there's at 40 frames per second, there's a greater sense of speed when you're moving past things, because the interpolation between 2 different parts of the cave when you're descending down it are a lot faster.
Yeah.
It's a lot less smooth, and so that sort of roughness gives it gives a sense that you're falling more, and I use the word visceral here a lot, but viscerally. And second, that big piano fill that's at the climax does not look natural with frame interpolation because it's a frame-based trick. So you'll notice at the zoom out, it feels suddenly a lot smoother when it hits that bing and it's flying out.
Yeah, like that kind of makes a lot more sense to me, because I seem to even recall seeing comments on the video saying, "Huh, I think maybe I think people were writing like, what was it? That the cave section was like too jittery," and I guess that kind of makes sense why you would be thrown off by that now, because you've changed the frames in between those sections.
Yeah, basically at the first hit that isn't being felt, it switched to a 40 frames per second
Mm.
view, so that it wasn't a sudden transition right at the piano fill. Yeah, it's. I also did that transition sort of to be a shift in pace, because Bosch kind of, well, very literally falls into the cave system, and the piano piece has this sort of like dissension that's happening, and there's a sort of degradation that's happening there that I think reflects in the switch from 60 to 40 frames per second. Yeah, I probably would have found a way to do it more gradually, but that's kind of difficult to do. But yeah, that's all I have to say on that. A little bit of technical detail. The rolling hills are that was a fun one to do. I worked with Rabbit a lot on the camera visuals. They were a huge part in making that fit and work well, because they have a lot of experience framing Line Rider scenery tracks in general. And so it was thanks to them that I was able to both build that sort of undulating feel and have it work with respect to where Bosch is positioned in the camera. Because that thing only kind of works if you let the hills take prominence in the camera view, and you have to put Bosch up so that you can see it the whole way.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, tell me a little bit more about this art style that you use, because I do recall in the old LRA server you posting something about this artist that you discovered, and then some of these screenshots followed. Is this the same artist that you kind of drew inspiration from for this track?
Yeah, Comixology is where I found it. I was browsing comics, and it was. I'm trying to remember the name of it. Um, right. It's called Rachel Rising. Uh, and uh, it's an interesting comic because a lot of it focuses sort of on backwoods, uh, foresty bits of like Americana, and so um, with very few lines, uh, the artist is able to evoke this very like wintry landscape, uh, but not in the sense that it's like covered in snow so much as it's like it's one of those things where you can feel how cold it is from the picture based on your own experiences being in it.
Hmm.
Um, and uh, it's not something I was looking to emulate so much as uh, the ability to use a lot to say or the ability to use a little to say a lot.
Yeah.
Um, is a useful thing in line writer, in art, in a lot of things. But yeah, I think if you want to get something across to a viewer, you uh in as constrictive a medium as a line writer is, you don't have a lot of ways to say things, and so you you necessarily need to make those little moments speak in
Yes.
really effective ways if you're looking to create something that evokes a thing,
Yep.
you know?
Yep. It can almost get to the point of seeing a little silly at times, but I mean, many of the artists we have in the community have demonstrated, numerous emotions in very effective ways. I mean, it's kind of amazing when you just kind of sit back and actually realize that people are doing this with a little dude on a sled. So,
I think,
go
yeah,
ahead. Go ahead.
there's, I think there's a lot of, I think early on when people were creating things in Line Rider, a lot of us were teenagers, right? And teenagers, on the whole, are not particularly good at expressing emotion in a genuine and vulnerable way. Like being vulnerable is one of the worst things a teenager can be made to feel, at least in my experience. Uh, and making art that is like trying to do very serious things through a medium that kind of feels a little silly. Uh, it just on its own. Conundrum refers to this as the kid on the sled. The kid on the sled creates this sort of dissonance between like a tension between the serious things you want to express and the silliness of expressing them via the kid on the sled. And so what you have to do, I'm not have to, but like what I have done to mitigate that, in addition to just biting the bullet and letting myself be emotionally vulnerable, which eh, I mean I'm hesitant to say this, but I don't think uh, even now a lot of people are not in a state where they are allowing themselves to be made emotionally vulnerable when they make tracks. But the easiest way to get rid of that dissonance between the serious concept and the kid on the sled is to make a situation in which both the message and the kid on the sled are can form an environment in which both the serious concept and the kid would naturally spring forth,
Oh yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like um an environment in which it's feasible for the kid on the sled to be experiencing these things.
Yep.
uh and that's what I had to do with Shortcut. I had to make it feel like, oh, into a forest. Oh, we're taking a shortcut through the cave. Oh, we're out on the hills. We're back to where we used to be. And like every single one of those things is something that our brain as viewers are able to like suspend our disbelief
Yeah.
enough to believe that this kid would be falling through caves.
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right about that. I mean, to be honest, I can kind of say, as far as from a creative standpoint, some of the more maybe emotionally driven tracks that I made, like states where you are just like more emotionally fragile, like some of the tracks that I made at that time were probably some of the best that I made in terms of like, I don't know, like actually expressing myself rather than just expressing whatever else I had, but rather just expressing a song. So I would
It's because
say, as an
mm-hmm.
example, I would probably give "Who We Want to Be" would be one example, and
Yeah,
then probably maybe First Steps, but First Steps was a little premature. Really, there's only like one section in there that really shows anything.
regardless of how refined it is, uh, I think if you make something genuine and from yourself, it's going to shine through. Um, I think I see this in a lot of uh, like in Bug Thief and the other works that Andrew has made.
Mm,
It's I feel there's a genuineness there
yep.
that uh, I don't see in a lot of other places that feels like this came from somebody. This is an expression of the self.
Yep.
Because I think a lot of tracks and track makers, if I'm being real, are guarded. They're very guarded about themselves, what they're trying to express, and so when they're trying to impart the seriousness of uh, what art evokes, because we look at art and we think, oh, that's very serious, and lots of people want to be taken seriously, like that art is taken seriously, but producing art that is taken seriously like that usually requires the ability to put yourself into that work. And so if you're detaching yourself from your work, if you're if you're making all of these things you're putting into your work so abstract that they are only understandable to you, then you've not only failed at being an effective artist, but you have also failed at being an emotionally vulnerable human being. So,
Mm, yeah.
uh, that's that.
Yeah. Before we get too sidetracked,
Yeah, back to shortcuts. Let's
yeah, back to shortcuts. I
hit
mean, I
hit
think
me.
to the viewers watching this, oh, my camera went out of focus. We will be discussing these sorts of things in an upcoming discussion, in an upcoming discussion. So stay tuned for that. But if we get back to shortcuts, if I kind of link back through all the
Yeah,
meandering, well, yeah. So
here,
with
watch.
this,
I'll connect it back right now. Shortcuts is something that I emotionally invest in myself into. Is
bang,
part is parts of my childhood and parts of the things that I have seen around me that I've internalized and I have brought back out through my lens.
yeah,
That is and that is something that I think is essential to the artistic process, and I think it is something that is essential to shortcut.
totally. And so I see kind of two outcomes of this track. I mean, before you told me about the emotionally vulnerable stuff, I mean, sure, like to me, I saw personally, I kind of saw the track more as just as a journey that was being shared with me, I guess. But I mean, we
Mm-hmm.
also had the style of the art that you used, which I think is great because it kind of opens up, like the scenery genre, I guess, if we can call it a genre, or it opens up the other people to see, well, hey, look, I mean, this creator made a track without using like hundreds of thousands of lines or hundreds of thousands of hours. I mean, I don't know how much time you actually spent on this track. I mean, you said what you made most of it in a week, right?
There are a lot of lines, but that's mostly due to the fact that I use the pencil tool.
Well, yeah. Hundreds of thousands of pencil cheetah lines. So,
Yeah, I was aided a lot by technology. I think the pencil tool now in the current linewriter.com build is the best one that has ever been made because of the way it scales with zoom. You can pick a level of detail that you want. Uh, and then all you really need to look at for like something like trees is just reference how like some of the leaves in the silhouette will poke themselves out, some of them will make themselves a little flatter against the side of the profile, and you just have to just keep mixing that up and it becomes like instinct.
Yep, yep, for sure. So we have this more accessible scenery style, which I like, 'cause I think that might encourage some people to diversify their line writer content, if I can call it content, rather than just their, I don't know, expression of themselves. I don't want to demean what people create, but I will use content for now until I think of a better word. So yeah, I mean, hopefully people will diversify that aspect of content, and as you say, hopefully they're willing to open themselves up. And I mean, I think personally there's a difference between, I mean, people can think that they're being open, but there's definitely a difference of being able to actually share that effectively. So I mean, that's definitely something I hope to see.
Yeah, it's not just when you make yourself vulnerable and you channel that into art, you have to be able to fully express and articulate that, I think. Uh, One of my old tracks, Come to Daddy, is an early, incomprehensible articulation of anger that I retroactively tried to make into a line writer horror film. Uh, but the more clearly you are able to articulate that in a way that other people can understand, that other people's experiences can jive with, um, the easier it is to make art that feels like it welcomes the other person into a landscape.
Yep, totally. So now to go on a different tack. Tell me about. I mean, I know the song that you chose kind of set up these different scenarios, but
Mm-hmm.
when you actually heard, like, say, like the first section, did it just immediately pop out to you? Oh, that's a forest. Like, oh, that's a cave, or oh, that could be hills, or is this just something that you added as you went along?
Okay. Difficult to answer question, but I think I here's the tack I'm going to take.
Sure.
So I heard the first part, and in my mind, I didn't imagine anything in particular, but the forest came about absolutely after uh, reading Rachel Rising. That was when I uh, really saw this being like sort of a contemplative, like forest walk, you know? And I had always pictured the rolling hills for that last section
Yeah.
because I always heard that bass note, and it reminded me of so many times where I've heard triplet songs and I just think about landing and then flying again every time. That's what that would always register as in my brain. Uh, I whenever I would be like, this would make a sick line writer track. If it was something that had like a triplet time, that da 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 da,
Mm,
right? Every time I would hear that bass note and I would think like that's landing and then that's flying again. And so I always knew what that last section was going to be.
yeah.
Um, and the middle section, I never, I never really had a solid idea of what that was going to be until I got down to brass tacks and started making the track.
Mm,
Uh, there were bits like, I mean, I knew it was like probably cave, because when I was coming up with the idea, like forest rolling hills, I was like, how do I connect that? And the simplest answer is Bosch takes like a shortcut through the cave. And the name became sort of a guidepost for what I wanted to do. I was like, Bosch is taking a shortcut through something. And I was like, I could make like Forest Under the Earth, but like better and in like something that would make sense with the broader narrative, you know? And so I was like, that's a style I can revisit, and that became
Yep.
how I used the music to make that section.
Okay. And would you say you specifically synced large sections of the track? I mean, you spoke about the rolling hills that you had that definitely in mind. But when I watched the forest section, it seemed maybe more atmospherically synced rather than some of the more precise syncs we tend to see in other tracks.
So it's that first part is completely synced. It's just not consistently synced because I wanted it to feel like very meandering.
Yeah.
And so what I did when I made this is I played around with the different parts of the phrase that would be synced with hits. So it'd be like da 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 da, like that first emphasis on each of those
Hmm.
is something I wanted consistent for the last part. But then for some parts of it, it would be like da 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 da, and so is that da
Yeah.
right there, because there are certain parts of the forest bit that will be sort of synced on offbeats instead, and so there are little experiments with syncopation throughout the
Okay. Yeah.
first part.
So
Um,
it's like almost trying to capture the feel of the forest in that sense, where it's not as direct. There's more different,
no,
nothing like that. Nothing as complicated as that. Just you experimenting then.
no, what I mean is like it meanders,
Mm.
and the forest is not a set in stone thing. You know that Bosch is going to the right, but like, does Bosch know? Does Bosch have the sense of direction that
Yeah.
we do seeing it from the frame?
Yeah.
No. So I did want to imbue it with a sense of like aimlessness in the first part for sure.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Because there's definitely a contrast between that and when he tips over into the cave and he had the really precise bits, and then it goes on into the rest of it. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I guess the last question I would be: is there anything you would change about this track? Anything you dislike, or do you love it?
It's not so much that I love it, is that I think it was an accurate expression of what I wanted to bring out of myself at that time, and so in that sense, I don't think it's something I need to change. Uh, it's not something like there's always going to be moments where I like have some regrets about the precision of certain things, but in terms of it as an entire product, I don't think there's anything that needs like I don't think there's anything that needs drastic revision because it's true to what I wanted it to be, and so I'm fine with that. Uh, Sometimes the things that are true to what you want them to be are gonna look a little warty to other people, but
I get that.
th- when you create them uh, as an honest expression of the self, it's gonna have warts, and you're not always gonna see them as being warts, but they will be to other people. So,
Awesome.
uh, yeah, that's all.
So, unless you have anything else you like to say, I guess we'll probably wrap that episode up here.
What do I gotta say? I mean, I made my big points. Uh, be emotionally vulnerable, cry 3 times a day. What else?
I'm writing all this down.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's my morning routine. I get up, I cry before my first one, and then I get to work, and then I take a 30-minute break to cry. That's my emotional vulnerability half hour. No, I just I think when people make tracks, they need to think about what they're doing and what they're feeling when they make the track, how they want other people to feel when they see them, and if they're interested in using Bosch themselves as a means for expressing that.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a lot of unexplored artistic territory in humanizing Bosch, and I want to see more people do that. That's all I got to say.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I'm glad you're getting it out there. That's something I would actually care to examine in a different format possibly in the future. So yeah, thanks for doing this again. I mean, people,
Yep.
make sure you go subscribe to OTDE, watch OTDE's tracks, subscribe again, then unsubscribe and resubscribe. Make sure you hit that bell.
Look, I get so many notifications when people do that.
All right. So, people watching this, leave some love or hatred, however you feel, down below, and we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye bye.
If you're leaving hatred, find a way that's not the YouTube. The YouTube comment section is a poor method for handling like seething anger.
Make
Because
it witty
like,
at least.
you see people in the YouTube comment, are they ever happy?
I think
like
YouTube is just a place of depravity and just general fear and hatred and intolerance.
okay. Well, on that lovely note, goodbye, all.
We love you, YouTube. Long live Article 13. We're out.